Right. Yeah. So guys, thank you so much for coming. Marty, thank you so much for being here. We're super extra uber excited that you have agreed to and suggested to have this Ask Me Anything session. Thank you so much for that.
But so I'm Marty Cagan, and I have been doing product for my entire career, always with tech companies, never with anything different than technology. And I've had one visit to Israel a few years ago, put on by one of your VCs, Aleph VC and Google Ventures. And I was able to meet about 100 startups on that trip. And so and of course, as somebody working in tech for my whole career, I've worked with Israeli teams for my whole career. Especially the engineering teams in Israel have been really among the best in the world for me. And so I've always enjoyed that. And it's a great question. I will tell you, I probably would answer that question depending on my mood, because some days I feel like we are losing the battle for good product. There are so many terrible, well, frankly, there's such terrible advice out there for product teams. And there's also more good advice than ever. But for every good voice, there's probably somewhere between 10 and 100 absolute nonsense voices. And so you really need to, do your homework and make sure that whoever you're listening to, you believe they actually can help you and they know what they're talking about. So as an example of what I mean, the vast majority of development in the world is not really good product teams at all. It's banks and insurance companies, and most of them are using these just horrible processes like SAFe, if you know what that is. Stands for Scaled Agile Framework. It's nothing to do with Agile. It's just marketing, but it is terrible. And there are so many people out there advocating this nonsense. And so to me, there's no question why there are so many failed efforts out there. It's funny, and I'm sort of seeing all your faces and your names. It's reminding me of my trip to Israel, because Israel is a really fascinating country to me in terms of tech. It's always been among the best teams I've ever seen, but I was very honest when I was out there. There are some things that Israel is not very good at as a country, as a culture for product yet. But the most important thing, it's in my opinion, the best in the world. And that is the most important thing for strong products is actually strong, empowered engineers. And Israel has more of them per capita than anywhere else I've seen in the world. And don't get me wrong, there are great engineers in San Francisco, in New York, in London, in Shanghai, in Sao Paulo. I've met teams everywhere. But per capita, Israel, I think, has the best. I think there's part of the culture, there's part of the sort of defense service that people get. But for whatever it is, the most important thing are these strong engineers. Now, I personally believe if Israel were to combine these strong engineers with seriously strong design and seriously strong product, they would be absolutely invincible as a country in terms of tech-powered products. So that was my interest, is to seeing the product and the design get as good as your engineering is. So the question was really about, what have I changed my mind on? It's not, I want to be clear, I don't advocate or I don't take credit for anything that we advocate. All we do is when we see techniques or practices work well in a good company, we'll share it with other companies. And eventually you get a body of knowledge of techniques that seems to work well. And that's what we advocate. And I would also say that those techniques are very different than what most companies use, those sort of not good companies. So, yeah, it's a big question. As far as specific techniques, the biggest issue with techniques is, I mean, there's a backlash against Agile now. There's a backlash against design thinking. There's backlash against OKRs, all these techniques. The problem is humans seem to want to use a technique for everything. They want a silver bullet, right? They want something that works all the time, and none of these things are for everything. And so a lot of what we need to do in product is show people when something's appropriate and when it's not. And it's a lot more about that than it is that, oh, that's a bad thing or a good thing. It is true that I don't recommend OKRs to most product teams anymore because they're not really product teams. They're what we call feature teams. And the OKR model, which actually, was popularized at Google and Facebook and LinkedIn, and of course it derived out of Intel, Andy Grove's work. That all came out of the empowered team model. And so if you try to apply that technique to feature teams, you're going to get a complete mess, which is what often happens.
So we have exactly a follow-up question about that. This is from Ran Barniv, and he's saying, by working in a feature team model, because the leadership still doesn't acknowledge the benefits of using product teams model, can LPM successfully lead the product discovery process without engaging the team in the entire discovery process, or is it doomed to fail from the beginning?
It's probably doomed to fail, but the issue, there's sort of two issues in that question. One issue is, can a product manager do discovery by him or herself? That's one issue. And the other issue is, can a team do discovery if they're in a feature team? And we should untangle those two things. The problem in a feature team, you're typically given a roadmap of features and projects to build. And if you already have been told this is the feature you have to build, then there is no real discovery there. Discovery is figuring out a solution to a problem. Somebody's already given you that solution. So in a feature team, they're not asked to do discovery. They're asked to do a little bit of design, maybe a little bit of usability testing if they're lucky. And then they just put it on the backlog and build it, code and QA and ship. And so, yeah, that's not discovery. And then can a product manager do discovery themselves, let's say himself, and then just sort of tell the designer and engineer what to do? Technically, you can. It's not that's not impossible, but it's definitely not advised. And the reason is it's not much better than a feature team. One of the phrases I love a lot, it actually, it came along with John Doerr, who was the guy that brought OKRs from Intel to Google. But he likes to say, look, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. And if a product manager just goes and does discovery and then comes down off the mountain and says, this is what we need to build, that's really no better than some executive coming to the team and saying the same thing. So your designer and your engineer may just go ahead and build it, but they won't be empowered. You're not using their real brains. You're not getting the benefit of what I said before, the most important thing, truly empowered engineers. The part that's missing, that maybe people who don't understand why feature teams are so bad at innovation, is they don't understand that the reason the engineers need to be there when you are actually coming up with the solution is because any good product is really the combination of a real customer issue, real pain, and something that's just now possible. And the engineers are what's bringing what's just now possible. And the product manager and even the designer are rarely able to do that. They can do some, but not nearly as much as the engineers can that are working with the technology all day, every day. So this is really the key, I think, behind everything, is this idea of giving engineers the ability to help solve the problem, not just build the code.
Do you have any specific tips? I think this relates to a question from Shira Luke Zilberman, who said, what do you recommend we do as a tech-biased industry, right? Sometimes I think it's the PMs who are less advantaged here in this ecosystem where the engineers are so strong. To grow strong product discipline, Shira is asking. You're spot on in your analysis of our ecosystem, she's saying.
Well, first of all, I should say, you have the good situation. The bad situation are those companies in most of the world where they believe the engineers are not important. You can just hire an outsourcing firm, hire Accenture. They can build whatever you want. And so that's a much harder change. If you've got a company where the engineers are very strong, you know, Shira phrased it as a tech-biased industry, but if it's sometimes called an engineering-centric culture, that is much easier to change. And what you need to do there is add on the product and design contribution. In most of those companies, the engineers and the executives, they don't actually know what the product manager is there to do. They don't know what the designer is there to do. They think the product manager is a project manager.
Right, and that goes back to the missionaries part as well, sort of to not only be the missionary of the product vision, but also of the product role.
Yeah, you do need to evangelize. We're really doing the religion metaphor here today, but you really do need to evangelize the roles so that people understand what product is really there for. But it's honestly not that hard if the product manager understands what her job is and she's willing to do the homework to prepare. That's usually the part. And honestly, whenever I find weak product managers, which I'll be honest, the weak link in most companies is not the engineers, is not the designer, it's usually the product manager. But I never blame the product managers. The fault for that is really the managers of the product managers. Because their number one job is to make sure that the product managers are competent people. They know how to do their job. That's not enough just to be smart, right? Competent people, they know how to do their job. And so what's tricky, and this leads back to the first question, I was describing how sometimes I get very depressed at all of the nonsense spouted out there. There's so many people out there that are trying to tell product managers how to do their job, and they're basically telling them to be a project manager. And I'm like, no, that is not the job. That is not the heart of the job. And so you try to give people guidance on, you know, what successful teams do.
Marty, I have a question that relates to that, and it's about recruiting the right people. As it seems to me, and I think that to a lot of other people, that the recruiting processes have become so long and so cumbersome. And I was just wondering, what is your opinion on this issue? I mean, how do we recruit better people, and what the process should look like?
Well, this is another really good topic because if I mentioned that coaching is really the biggest responsibility for the leaders, but where do you find those people? So that takes us back to recruiting and staffing. And coincidentally, I have a book I've been working on for over a year, and today is actually the day I turned that book into the publisher. And it talks about it. This book is, the first book was aimed at product teams. This book is aimed at the leaders. And in fact, recruiting and staffing is one of the big topics, because I agree with you, most companies are completely confused when it comes to staffing. Now, there's a lot of problems there. One of the biggest problems is that the managers think that HR can actually help them find good people, which of course they can't. HR is not there for that. This is the most important thing, is the manager needs to realize that she needs to be the hiring manager. She needs to be the primary person to recruit and go out. As hiring manager, she needs to own recruitment. And so then that leads to the question of, what do you really look for? Well, in a product manager, product is unlike design and engineering. There aren't many programs in universities or that teach this. So mostly we have to teach the person once they join our company, which leads back to the coaching discussion. So what you're really looking for, though, are, I mean, actually early Google used to describe their product managers, the people they look for, as just very smart people that know how to get things done. And I actually think that's still a very useful description of what to look for. But those people, that just tells you who to hire. Then what you need to do is actually coach them. I think somebody
sorry, Marty. Yeah, we're trying to mute everyone. If you have kids in the background, we love kids, but please not for it's too soon for them to be recruited as PMs. We're going to try and mute everyone. Yeah, sorry, you were saying that the recruiting, the hiring manager has the responsibility. And the best advice is intelligent people. Sorry, we are unmuting you. Trying to mute everyone. There
we go. Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, yeah, the hiring manager needs to take responsibility. And what I was saying is they need to make sure they're getting the right foundation, which, again, one way of describing that is smart people that know how to get things done. It's also referred to as smart, creative, persistent. There's lots of different ways, but most importantly, what you need to do is make sure that you give them the coaching they need in order to become competent. They can have, a lot of companies I've been helping and encouraging them to set up APM programs. Google has an APM program. Many companies do today. That's a good way to get people up to speed. Coaching, training, whatever, but they need to come up to speed. And maybe it's worth just reiterating what it means to be a competent product manager. First of all, it means that product manager has to be an expert in your actual users and customers. If you don't have that firsthand experience with your users and customers, and there's a really easy litmus test for that. If your CEO of your company should believe that you know as much as product manager, you know as much about the customers as anybody else in the company, that should be critical. If they don't think you do, if they think the salespeople know more about customers or the executives do, then they're not going to listen to the product manager, and they probably shouldn't. So the first foundation is deep knowledge of the customers. I remember when I first became a product manager, the person who was coaching me would not let me make a single decision unless I had visited 30 customers face-to-face, 15 in the US, 15 in Europe, before he would let me make any decisions at all. And so anyway, this is number one. Number two is the product manager needs to become an expert in the data that's generated. So even if you have a great data analyst or a data scientist, that is a great resource on a team, but it's not an excuse for the product manager not to know the data. They have to know how the users are interacting with our product, how they're buying our product, how those patterns are changing over time. So you need to be an expert in how our product is used. The third, and is usually the biggest for most product managers, is the product manager needs to understand your business. I'm not talking about your customer's business here. That was the first. I mean your business. And that is really difficult. That's what's meant by the phrase, a good product manager is the CEO of her product, because unlike a CEO, you have to know all aspects of the business. You have to know how the product is marketed, how it's sold, how it's supported, how it's financed, how it generates income, how we monetize it, what the privacy issues are, security issues are, legal issues, ethical issues. All of this is what's meant by a product manager understanding your business. And the fourth is that you have to understand the industry. You have to understand the competitive landscape. You have to understand the industry trends and which ones are going to be relevant to you and which ones are not. So those are the four big competencies of any product manager. And it's really your manager's job to get you to the point where you're competent in those four before you're able to really lead a team.
Perfect, thank you. There's a follow-up question, I think it's related, from Noah Ganot, who's asking if there's any advice on leading product when you are in a remote location compared to your market, which happens to us a lot here in Israel, obviously.
Of course it does. But you know what, that's been true forever. Really, any company, even US companies, very quickly, they want to sell all over the world and their customers are everywhere. The question of remote is always a big topic. The most important, well, first of all, to answer the question directly, we have plenty of techniques of testing with our users and customers remotely. The best company I ever saw do that well was early Skype, actually, which was a London-based company, engineers in Estonia, but their customers were all over the globe. And so that's not so hard. I'll tell you what's actually harder is when the product manager is remote from her engineers. That's harder. Because if it's not a big deal to be remote from your customers, we have good ways of overcoming that. But if you're remote from your engineers, you really have to work harder to keep that dynamic, the healthy dynamic we need. Otherwise, you'll end up reverting into just send the engineers specs.
Right, there was a follow-up question exactly on that from Edik Mittelman, who asked, how do you combine an Israeli and, for example, SF or Shanghai teams who work together on one product and have big differences in culture and the engineering PM superpowers, etc.? So if there's any practical tip.
And language, absolutely. These are very hard. Now, the first thing we would do is, even if you're working on the same product, like Zoom, Zoom actually has engineers. Most of the engineers for Zoom are in China. A lot of the product team is in San Francisco. That's an example. So even though you're working on a big product, what we try to do is get our product teams to be co-located when they can. So having a whole product team in Tel Aviv, another product team in Haifa, and another product team in Shanghai, that actually works quite well. It's still possible, it's just harder if you cut up a team. So within a product team, let's say the product manager is in Tel Aviv and the designer is in Haifa and your engineers are in Shanghai. That's the hardest situation. And it does require a lot of these video calls at weird hours. It requires a lot of travel. So I don't want to pretend it is not optimal.
Yep, thanks. So we're moving on to sort of more hardcore about products. And there's a question from Omer. What's your approach to discovery of heavy data products? Where fake data or mockups are almost meaningless, and building a mockup with the real data costs nearly as much as building the live first version.
Yeah, this is a common question. It's a good question though, because it's the right question. Because what's the person's asking is like, how do we prototype these hard experiences? And now the first thing I should say is that we have a specific kind of prototype called a live data prototype exactly for this purpose. And I want to be clear, a live data prototype is about an order of magnitude less work than a product. So it's more work than what's called a user prototype, which are the simulations or more like mock-ups, but it's a lot less work than a product. But even so, a live data prototype is it might take you a few days to do instead of a few months to build the product. It's still time. The other thing I would say is that it is a little more complicated than that. It's not, almost every product has data. There's very few products that don't. And a lot of people are confused. They think that people have to have their data in order to make good judgments on a prototype, which is mostly not true. What they need is realistic data. It has to feel like it could be their data, but it doesn't actually have to be their data. So there is a whole class of prototypes that has extremely realistic data. In fact, the user usually wouldn't even know it's not real data. So it's realistic data, but not live data. And for many products, that is just fine. Now, the only way to really understand what I'm talking about is you have to understand with product, there are 4 kinds of risks always. So to really answer that question, we would have to talk about which risk this prototype was created to address. So the first risk is value risk. Would somebody even buy this product? The second risk is usability risk. Could they figure out how to use this product? The third risk is feasibility risk. Can our engineers figure out how to build this product? And the fourth risk is viability risk, which is, would this product be legal in the EU countries? Maybe because of privacy reasons, for example. So those are the 4 risks. So to really answer that question about realistic data versus live data, it depends on the risk. For most of those risks, realistic data is just as good in terms of validating the risk as live data. But for some things, we really need live data, which is why I don't want to give the wrong impression. I am a huge fan of a live data prototype. It has saved the day on so many products. So many products literally wouldn't be here today without live data prototypes, because the leaders would never have paid to build a product version because they thought it wouldn't have worked. In fact, a lot of Amazon's best innovations are that way. Spotify, I don't know if you guys use Spotify. I'm a user of Spotify and I love it. But Spotify's Discover playlists, they're basically machine learning based playlist generation. That was all done with a live data prototype. They wouldn't have done it without that. Nobody's going to actually spend the time and money without the evidence that it's going to be worth building. So it is critical when it's necessary, and that's how we do it. It's just most of the time I can show a team that they don't even need to do the live data prototype. As long as they do realistic data, they can actually do it in just hours.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Marty. I want to go back to the empowerment issue and ask you about something that I see as a confusion between empowerment and the fear of taking decisions. So it seems that sometimes managers refuse to decide on something until each and every one in the team would agree on it, and perhaps it looks like empowerment, but to me it seems like the origin is different. What would you say to that?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because there's really 2 important topics in there. The first topic, empowerment, really means who gets to decide. In a feature team, management decides, and then the team is just there to build. In an empowered team, the team gets to decide. And that team, product manager, designer, engineers, they get to decide. So that's what empowerment means. Now, you're also asking, but how do they actually make a decision? because there's many ways to make a decision, right? You just cited what's referred to as the consensus model. In the consensus model, everybody has to agree. And by the way, I hate that model. I think it just drives me nuts. Nobody seems to like that model. It's one of those models that sounds good, but if you think about it, any single person can say no, and everything stops. It feels like the opposite of empowerment in practice. And I have a little sympathy because the consensus model comes from people that have a good heart, right? They want you to feel like you're included. And so, but anyway, it goes wrong. So I never advocate the consensus model. The other model for decision on the other extreme end of the spectrum is the dictatorship. This is when the product manager just says, I'm the product manager, I decide. That's no good either. And what most good teams do is the middle model, which is referred to as the collaborative model. In the collaborative model, the person who has the expertise is basically what you go to. So if it's a technical question, your tech lead would decide. If it's an user experience question, your designer would decide. If it's a business viability question, your product manager would decide. And if we still disagree, we run a test. Because if it's opinion, we can still end up disagreeing, so we'll run a test. So the way good teams make a decision is this collaborative model I'm describing.
Great, thank you, Marty. That's awesome. I'm looking here at the questions. Everyone, if you still have questions, we have a few more minutes, so please put your questions in the chat if we need some, if you have anything that you feel we want to cover. And I think a follow-up question on something that you said from Maor Curiel, what's the best way to evangelize? How can we as PMs know what the right path is? And there's another question which is talking about intuition. How much should you trust your intuition? So I think maybe both of them, if you can say something about those, Marty, please.
Well, I want to be clear. When we talk about evangelizing, the question is, what are you evangelizing? There's, you can evangelize anything. Normally, when we talk about evangelism, we're talking about making sure everyone in your company understands your product vision. That's normally what most people mean by evangelizing the vision. So this is often referred to as the North Star. The point is that everybody knows where we're going and why. So that's really the responsibility of the head of product. But of course, the head of product, once they evangelize, they're trying to get everybody else to help evangelize as well. So that's what's going on. The question might have been coming from a different point, but that's the main interpretation of evangelism. So the person who asked the question will probably have to tell me if that's what he or she had in mind.
Okay, great. Then we had the question, sorry, here it is, from Olga Goldenberg. Do you think an experienced PM can move between different industries?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things we've really learned is that domain experience is a lot less important than people thought. It usually is much easier to take a product manager from a good team that knows how to do product and teach that person a new domain than it is to take somebody that knows the domain and teach them product skills. In fact, I've seen that repeated thousands of times. Good product people love to learn new spaces. It's normal, just like good engineers do and good designers do. Now, certain spaces, like if you were building, let's say, a machine learning based surgical device, then for surgery, you're not expecting the product manager to be a surgeon, but you are expecting in that case that the product manager would have access to a subject matter expert like a surgeon.
Yeah. Marty, a question about strategy. It's from Anat Eldar, and she's asking, when your direct manager doesn't find value in taking the time to build a reasonable product strategy that will lead the way and prefers to react when things happen, is there any way to convince him differently?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really common problem. This is very old. It's an old saying, but I see it unfortunately every day. People join a company, but they leave their manager, right? And the most common reason people leave their job is because of their manager. It's not because of the pay or whatever. It's usually because their manager doesn't care about them as a professional, doesn't want to help them develop in their career. This example is maybe a manager that doesn't even understand why strategy is important, just wants to be reactive. So there are a lot of reasons people are not good managers. Assuming this manager would like to become better and improve, then there are definitely ways that he or she could become a better manager. That is the subject of my next book I was mentioning before. I want to help managers become better managers. Most managers I know, they know they're not good at product strategy and they want to become better. They just where do you go learn about good product strategy? It's just not something that the way most people have learned it is because they were lucky enough to work at a good company where they had leaders that did it well. And so they learned by doing and by coaching. So
or we can send them your book.
Yeah. And honestly, I wrote a bunch of articles on product strategy recently that had a very good response. So
in Israel as well.
Okay, good.
Okay, we have a question here, and it's great because I heard you already refer to this topic, and I think it's a very important question. Ophir Kraus is asking, what's the line between product designer and product manager? Real designers are supposed to solve problems for users in a very similar way to what you're describing. And I know you have strong opinions about this, Martin. They're super important here, I think.
I do. And I will just say, if you understand the role of product manager, there should be no confusion between the product manager role and the product designer role. In every case I find that there is confusion about those two, it's because they don't understand the role of the product manager. Now, it's almost always because it's a feature team. So product designers are incredibly valuable. I don't want to, I'm talking mostly about product managers, but I adore great designers. Product designers, they're responsible for service design, interaction design, visual design, and user research. Those are absolutely critical skill sets. Just like I wouldn't want to build a product without engineers, that's sort of nonsense to most people would understand that would be crazy. I don't want to build a product without experienced professional product designers. Now, those skills, there are not many product managers that even have those skills, even though this really drives me nuts, but there are a lot of product managers that know nothing about design, which means they actually think they're good designers. They do. They tell me they're good designers, and you could see it in the products. They have no idea. You know what they know how to do? They know a little bit of basics on user research. They know how to use Balsamiq in order to do a wireframe, which anybody can use Balsamiq. That doesn't make you a designer, right? So this is important. The people that are confused are usually, if you're a feature team, and you usually have somebody with a title product manager, but they don't need a product manager. The things that we do as a product manager are not really necessary on a feature team because the leaders are making the decisions on value and viability, especially. And so what is the product manager supposed to do? They're mostly there to be a project manager. They're there to shepherd the work through to the designer and the engineers. And it's not surprising that thousands of designers and engineers have said to me and to many others, why do we need a product manager? It's a very legitimate question on a feature team.
Yeah, it brings us to a similar question that's being asked here more again and again. Is it possible to have an empowered product manager with feature developers? How can I involve developers more when they say, just tell me what to build?
So this is a little bit complicated, but it's really critical. I said at the beginning of this discussion that the most important thing were empowered engineers. Well, so and it is really true. But the truth is, most product teams have somewhere between 2 and about 10 engineers. And while I want to be honest, my favorite product teams at the best companies, all of the engineers care about this. They are all like we're talking about. The way we often phrase it is, they care as much about discovery as they do about delivery. They care as much about inventing as about coding. However, we can do very well, fine, even if we just have one engineer like that. If you have one tech lead, that's usually the tech lead, that does care about what we build, not just how we build it, then you can have a great product team. And even at some great, I know teams at Google that have not all their engineers are that way. So we can do that. We can make it work, but we have to have at least one. Now, a lot of times when a product manager will tell me, it's such a common thing for them to say, none of my engineers want to do this. They just want to be told what to do, what to build. And I have learned a long time ago that whenever I hear that, I insist on talking to the engineers myself. Because first of all, significant percentage of the time, the engineers tell me something very different. They really do. They are like, that is not true. They'll say, look, the big problem we have is when we don't find out what we need to build before it's a commitment. And then they have to spend all this time unwinding from these problems. The bigger issue, though, is that I asked the engineers, when was the last time you actually got to visit a customer? When was the last time you actually got to see the pain yourself? And it is so easy to motivate engineers. They are incredibly motivated by seeing people in pain or struggling with their product. And it really frustrates me because so many of them say, oh, I have never been to a customer, or maybe, my first month with the company and then no more. And now you can start to see where I start to get irritated. A lot of times I'll go back to the product manager and they'll say, look, we can't afford that time. The engineers need to build every minute. So we realize what's really going on is the product manager is the problem. And they are really thinking like a project manager, not a product manager.
Great, thank you, Marty. So we have only a few more minutes. I want to ask something about for the more senior people in the room. When we talk about product teams and empowered teams, and you have multiple of those working on this one product, I've just recently read about Spotify that the squads didn't really work when you need to coordinate between a few different teams on the one product. So taking this strategy, splitting it into product teams, at the end of the day, it all needs to be one product that speaks in the same language. Any tips around those things? We've heard of guild models, we've heard of sort of professional ladders models. If you want to talk a little bit about how you build an organization like that, and I think that will be our last question, unless we manage to squeeze another one.
Are you referring to that article that said that Spotify wasn't really using the Spotify model?
Yes.
Yeah, that article was not a very well done article. I was mentioning there's a lot of people that don't know what they're talking about. that's another example of that. It actually was so bad that I wrote an article about that. It's called Spotify versus Fitbit, and I would encourage you to look at that. Don't get me wrong, Spotify knew about these issues. And interestingly, Google, at the time when Spotify was running into these, Google was running into the same things. And I wrote a series of articles about autonomy, because that's the real topic here, autonomy. And how much autonomy do you give the teams versus the managers? And I actually saw those things were brewing already at both Google and at Spotify. But because both of those companies had the empowered engineers, I knew they were going to do well. And so, I mean, I didn't really answer your question. I was just pointing out that that's a really good example of bad advice. In fact, the person in their article said, oh, you should try, so the Spotify process isn't good. You should try the process that Fitbit used, which is this process called SAFE, which is the worst process, I think. I honestly am agnostic with process, but when you talk about stuff like that, that is the opposite of empowered engineers. And Fitbit literally went from, I think it was $6 billion to less than $2 billion in value. So, I mean, terrible, terrible advice. And Spotify, of course, has done incredibly well. Any company would be grateful to have the success Spotify has had. And now the real question is, do you need leaders to connect the dots when you have many teams? Absolutely. The guild model is a way to do it. It's not as powerful as what most companies use, but it is a way to do it. But one way or another, this is back to that original topic, the role of coaching. You need to make sure that the leaders, the managers of product design and engineering are helping to connect all of the different teams into a single larger whole. It's referred to as holistic view role.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Marty. The last question is from Zach, I think that's his name. And it's quite a personal question, I think. Can you point to a milestone you achieved in your career that you feel defined you as a product manager?
I mean, it's been a long career, so there's been a lot of milestones. But I think in terms of product manager, what really made a big impression on me is, I mentioned the first 10 years of my career was as an engineer. And I did a lot of products. They were all products for developers, and I loved these products. But one of the products I did was this big product effort. And anyway, long story short, it had amazing technology. I still have patents to my name with that product, but it was a complete failure of a product. And so that's the first time I really realized that it's not all about engineering. I realized that unless the engineers are given good problems to solve, it doesn't really matter how great your engineers are. And so that's what made me interested in product side. And I've always been interested in product teams. I really care about teams, but I do spend a lot of time on with product managers because they are usually the weakest link in the team.
Okay, learning by failure. That's, I think we're all familiar with it. Okay, so I think we're gonna have to wrap up now because our hour is done. Thank you so much, Marty. I'm sure that I'm representing each and every one of the exactly 100 people that made it to Zoom feels. It was a privilege and a great honor to have you here with us. The product management community in Israel is thrilled, as you can see from the remarks in the chat. So thank you so much again. Hiccups at the beginning. And rock on. We'll continue translating your articles.
All right. Well, I hope I get out there to see you guys again soon. So thank you very much and good luck.
Thank you so much, guys. We're still gonna hang here for a few more minutes, but
Thank you.
Okay.
Marty.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you, Marty.
Okay.